More than a month has passed since the United States and Israel launched a war against Iran, and we can now conclusively say that Tehran is winning this war. This is now being admitted in major Western newspapers. The Independent published an article titled, "Iran is the clear winner as Trump's desperate bid for peace shows he wants out of the war." This is incredible because most Western media outlets have supported every single major U.S. war for decades, including 2 wars on Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, on Libya, Syria, Yemen, the list goes on and on. But this is the first war that I've ever seen that many major media outlets are in fact criticizing from the very beginning. Politico, for instance, published an op-ed arguing that the U.S. war on Iran is a far bigger blunder and strategic error than the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And this article was written by the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, someone who previously supported the war on Iraq. So today we're going to go into more detail explaining how Iran is winning this war. And to do so, we're going to look at Iran's strategic goals and assess how Tehran has been accomplishing them. The first and most obvious is preventing regime change and preventing state collapse. It's obvious that the US and Israel initially thought they could destroy the Iranian government by carrying out so-called decapitation strikes targeting all of the political and military leaders of the government. But they have failed to do so. In fact, the Iranian government has not only shown that it's resilient, it's probably stronger now because it has more popular legitimacy, because even critics of the Iranian government inside the country have rallied behind the flag and are now supporting the state and trying to prevent the US and Israel that launched this war of aggression from taking control of their country. So then let's look at another Iranian strategic goal, which is to expel the US military from the region. Now, the US has been surrounding Iran militarily for decades. The US built up 24 bases surrounding Iran in almost all of the neighboring countries. But in response to this US-Israeli war of aggression, Iran retaliated in self-defense and hit most of these US bases. The Turkish state media outlet, the Anadolu Agency, compiled official data on the Iranian strikes on these US military bases, and it reported on the 30th of March, so after a month of this war, that Iran carried out at least 5,471 missile and drone attacks targeting US bases and critical sites in 7 Arab countries that are allied with the US. These Iranian attacks have been remarkably successful. In fact, the New York Times reported that the US has basically been pushed out of all of its bases in the region. This was revealed in an incredible article titled, "Iran's Attacks Force US Troops to Work Remotely." I'm reading here from the New York Times. And by the way, keep in mind, this is a newspaper that strongly supported the illegal US invasion of Iraq in 2003, along with the US wars on Afghanistan and Libya and Syria and Yemen. So the New York Times is certainly not in any way an anti-war newspaper, but the New York Times has acknowledged that, quote, "Iran has bombed US bases across the Middle East in retaliation for the US-Israeli war, forcing many American troops to relocate to hotels and office spaces throughout the region," end quote. Which, by the way, explains why Iran has hit some hotels in the region. It's not because Iran is targeting civilian areas. It's because there are US military targets that are in these civilian hotels in the region. In fact, the New York Times wrote that, quote, "Now much of the land-based military is, in essence, fighting the war while working remotely," end quote. So you know how so many people have been working from home since the pandemic? Well, now even the military is working remotely. And this is because Iran has destroyed their bases. By the way, this New York Times article is based on interviews with US military officials. So they're acknowledging it. The Pentagon is now admitting this. And the New York Times noted that US troops have been relocated to makeshift alternative sites. It noted that before the U.S. and Israel started this war, there were around 40,000 U.S. troops in West Asia, the so-called Middle East. But now many of these troops have been relocated and sent as far away as Europe. I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes here. This is another very important aspect of this war. But there are some U.S. forces who are still based in West Asia. However, they're not in their original bases. The New York Times wrote, and this is the money quote here, quote, "Many of the 13 military bases in the region used by American troops are all but uninhabitable," end quote. So Iran has succeeded in basically destroying all of the major U.S. bases in the region, including the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the biggest and most important U.S. base in the region. It is the air headquarters, or it was the air headquarters of U.S. Central Command, and Iran has hit the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, another major part of the U.S. Navy. So Iran has succeeded largely in expelling the U.S. military occupiers from West Asia. So this raises the question, where have these U.S. troops gone? And this brings us to another remarkable article in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Europe is quietly playing a crucial role in the Iran war." This article noted that the U.S. military is using many bases across Europe. It notes that U.S. bombers, drones, and ships have been fueled, armed, and launched via bases in the UK, Germany, Portugal, Italy, France, and Greece. And it notes that the nerve center of the U.S. war against Iran is the Ramstein base in Germany. And together, these military bases in Europe are, quote, "facilitating one of the most logistically complex operations the U.S. military has been involved in for decades," end quote. The Wall Street Journal quoted a U.S. Air Force general who is the top military commander of NATO, and he said most European U.S. allies, quote, "have been extremely supportive," end quote. The U.S. has around 40 military bases across Europe, which host 80,000 U.S. military forces, and the Wall Street Journal described Europe as a, quote, "launch pad for U.S. operations in both the Middle East and Africa," end quote. The report also included a map showing some of the bases that the U.S. is using in Europe in order to wage this war on Iran. Again, these bases are located in the UK, Germany, Portugal, Italy, France, and Greece. Therefore, all of these countries are parties to the war. Some of their governments may claim that supposedly they're neutral or claim they're not involved in the war. That is not true. They are parties to the conflict. They are involved because they're allowing the U.S. to use their territory to wage this war of aggression against Iran. So with all of that said, let's look back at the list of Iran's strategic goals in this war. It can pretty conclusively be said that, at least in the short term, Iran has largely succeeded in expelling the U.S. military from West Asia. Tehran has destroyed all of the major U.S. bases in the region, and that's why the U.S. has been forced to use bases in Europe thousands of kilometers away. Now, it's certainly possible that after this war ends, the U.S. could rebuild some of these military bases and continue deploying U.S. troops to the region. However, this brings us to another major Iranian goal, which is to force the regimes of the Persian Gulf to reconsider their alliance with the U.S. and Israel. Because pretty much all of these countries in the region host U.S. military bases. And previously, they may have thought that those U.S. military bases were protecting them, but we now see that those U.S. military bases were actually endangering them, because when there's another war in the future, Iran will likely hit these Persian Gulf regimes because they're facilitating the U.S. war. They're not neutral. Again, these Persian Gulf regimes claim that supposedly they're not parties to the conflict. It's not true. They're allowing the U.S. to use their territory to wage war on Iran, which is why they have been hit in retaliation in self-defense by Tehran. So this is naturally going to make them second guess in the future when the U.S. tries to rebuild these bases. Some of these Gulf regimes may say, well, we don't really want these bases because we thought you were protecting us, but you're actually not protecting us. So no, thank you. And one of the goals of Tehran has been to pressure the Gulf regimes not to normalize relations with Israel. And in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion and pressure by the US government on the Saudi monarchy to normalize relations with Tel Aviv. This came after the first Trump administration in 2020 successfully pressured the UAE and Bahrain to officially normalize relations with the Israeli regime in the so-called Abraham Accords. And ever since then, the US has been trying to pressure other Gulf regimes to also normalize relations with the Israeli regime. This is not only under Trump, but also under Joe Biden. His administration also tried to pressure Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel, and Riyadh was hesitant, and now in his second term, Trump has been trying to do this once again. But I think this war is now going to incentivize the other Gulf regimes to second guess or triple guess any possibility of normalizing with Israel, because they now see that there are very high consequences for being allied with the US and Israel if and when there's another war with Iran. And this could literally make the region inhospitable. So getting back to the list of goals, this brings us to another goal. Iran has wanted sanctions lifted. Let's not forget that in 2015, Iran signed the nuclear deal, officially known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran signed this with the US and the other permanent members of the UN Security Council and the European Union. It was written into international law, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, said very clearly that Iran was abiding by the agreement. It was not violating the nuclear deal. Despite that, in 2018, during Trump's first term, he withdrew unilaterally from the JCPOA in violation of international law. He sabotaged the Iran nuclear deal, and he imposed sanctions on Iran. Again, I must stress, this was a clear violation of international law. And ever since then, Iran has suffered economically due to the US so-called maximum pressure campaign against it. In fact, just a few weeks before the US and Israel launched this war on Iran, Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager from Wall Street, Scott Bessent, he did an interview on Fox News in which he boasted that the US sanctions against Iran were responsible for collapsing Iran's economy, as he put it. And Washington proudly took credit for the sky-high rates of inflation, the shortage of goods, and the mass protests that were going on in Iran due to the economic suffering caused by these US sanctions. So Iran has really wanted to get these sanctions lifted. They've caused so much pain. And ironically, one of the results of this war is that the US has been forced to lift sanctions on Iran. Now, I don't think this is a long-term decision. I think this is a short-term decision. But regardless, the message in Tehran is very clear. It defended itself in this war, it exacted a cost upon the US and its allies, and it pressured Washington to lift sanctions. Treasury Secretary Bessent, who just a few weeks ago was boasting of how the sanctions collapsed Iran's economy, he was personally forced to make exemptions for these sanctions on Iran to allow Tehran to export its oil. And why is that? It's because Iran demonstrated that it has significant leverage by controlling access to the Strait of Hormuz. This is a narrow strait right off the coast of Iran that is the most important oil transit choke point on Earth. Before this war, about 20% of all of the globally traded oil was passing through this narrow strait on a daily basis. In response to the US-Israeli war, Iran shut it down. So getting back to our list of Iran's strategic goals, this brings us to the final point. We can conclusively say that Iran has succeeded in establishing deterrence. What does that mean? Deterrence is the ability to prevent another actor from carrying out an action that you don't like because they know that it will be very costly for them and they will have more disadvantages than advantages if they carry out that action. So in more concrete terms, Iran has established deterrence because it has demonstrated to the U.S. and Israel that if they want to wage another war against Iran, like they did during the so-called 12-day war in June of 2025, they will really